Jesus Christ screamed, "Stop!" directly into the cab of Leo Callahan's truck, just as the darkness of the Arizona desert threatened to swallow him and the massive pileup ahead. Leo, fighting sleep and sorrow, slammed the brakes, the divine command overriding 40 years of trucking instinct. The massive rig shuddered to a halt inches from disaster. Subscribe for more stories of faith and tell us in the comments, have you ever heard a warning voice? The silence in the cab of the Peterbilt was a physical weight, heavier than the cargo of industrial piping Leo hauled west. It was the silence left by Martha, gone 6 months and 1 day. And it was a silence that had consumed the last vestiges of Leo's easy faith. For 40 years, the road had been his sanctuary. Now, it was just a long, lonely prison. He glanced at the rearview mirror, where Martha's favorite rosary, the blue glass beads she'd carried since their wedding, swung gently. He'd tried the prayers earlier, pulling over near a desolate gas station off exit 178, folding his hands over the steering wheel. He'd recited the Hail Marys, but the rhythm was broken, the words meaningless. He felt like he was speaking into a void, believing, perhaps, that God was simply too busy with larger tragedies to worry about the heartbreak of one aging trucker. Leo was not just physically tired, he was spiritually depleted. He had driven 12 hours straight, pushing past his legal limit, fueled only by stale coffee and a desperate need to keep moving. Every time he stopped, the grief caught up. Every time he pulled the curtain across the bunk, he remembered the smell of Martha's pillow. So he drove. He sought the numbing monotony of the asphalt, hoping to outrun the pain that clawed at his chest. His eyes burned. He rubbed the stubble on his chin, fighting the white line fever, that hypnotic state where the yellow dividers seemed to stretch into infinity. The digital clock on the dash read 11:34 p.m. He was 15 miles from the next major stop, but the road ahead was suddenly shifting. The air pressure dropped violently. The wind, previously a steady hum, became a vicious, tearing sound, rattling the trailer doors. A wall of dust, thick and impenetrable, rose ahead of him, obscuring the high beams. Leo sighed, weary beyond measure. He knew he should pull over immediately, but the thought of sitting there, alone in the choking grit, was unbearable. "Just get me 15 more miles, Lord," he muttered, but the prayer felt like a demand, not a plea. He accelerated slightly, pushing the massive truck toward the blinding orange cloud. He was operating on fumes, both diesel and spiritual, and in that moment of profound vulnerability and exhaustion, he made the fatal decision to ignore the warning signs of the desert and press forward into the dark unknown. He was convinced he was the only soul on the road, utterly alone, heading straight into the curve where the disaster waited patiently. The roar of the engine and the frantic whipping of the wind were the only sounds Leo could register, as the truck's massive grille plunged into the suffocating cloud of dust. The sudden darkness was absolute, a heavy, choking blanket that stole the stars and the road lines alike. Leo squinted, leaning forward, his heart beginning to pound with belated panic. He couldn't see the hood ornament. He couldn't see anything. He had made a terrible mistake. He gripped the steering wheel, ready to hit the brakes, but inertia and muscle memory held him back. The truck was traveling at 65 miles per hour, and the thought of jackknifing the rig in this zero-visibility nightmare froze him. He was committed. In that fraction of a second, when fear was turning into cold dread, the air in the cab changed. It was not a physical change, but an atmospheric shift, like stepping from a cold, desolate street into the radiant warmth of a cathedral sanctuary. The oppressive sound of the diesel engine seemed to instantly diminish, muffled by a profound, otherworldly stillness. Then the voice arrived. It was not a sound that entered his ears, but a vibration that resonated deep within his chest, striking his soul like a perfectly tuned bell. It was crystalline, infinitely gentle, yet possessed an authority that transcends all earthly power. It was the voice of pure grace, the sound of unconditional love, and it left no doubt as to its origin. It was the unmistakable, gentle command of Jesus Christ. Stop, Leo. Put your foot on the floor. Now. The urgency was not born of anger, but of desperate, saving love. It was a clear, immediate instruction, bypassing the fog of fatigue and the paralysis of fear. Leo didn't pause to analyze or rationalize. 40 years of cynical weariness dissolved instantly under the weight of that divine presence. The voice didn't belong here, not on this dark road, not in this cab. Yet it filled every corner of the space with a blinding, golden light that only Leo could perceive. He slammed his right foot down, not just braking, but driving his full weight onto the pedal as if trying to push the floor out of the cab. The air brakes shrieked, a deafening, metallic scream of protest. The truck bucked violently, the massive trailer attempting to overtake the cab, threatening to flip them both. Leo's body was thrown forward against the seatbelt, the blue glass rosary swinging wildly, illuminated by the internal dome light. The deceleration was brutal, instantaneous, a life-altering jolt. The 80,000 pounds of steel and cargo fought against the sudden stop, but the power of the divine command had already been executed. The rig slid, tires burning rubber against the asphalt for a terrifying 100 feet, then shuddered one last massive time and finally, miraculously, stopped. The silence that followed was broken only by the loud, panicked rush of air from the exhausted brakes. The dust storm continued to swirl around the truck, but Leo was no longer looking at the dust. He was looking at the small space directly in front of his bumper. As the last particles of grit settled, illuminated by his headlights, he saw the horror he had narrowly avoided. He was 2 feet, literally the length of his arm, from the crushed taillights of a small family minivan. Had he traveled one more yard, the velocity of his truck would have vaporized the entire vehicle and the 20 cars piled up behind it. Leo sat motionless, his hands still clenched on the wheel, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The spiritual warmth, the divine resonance, was slowly receding, leaving behind a profound, searing realization. He had been pulled back from the edge of catastrophe, not by luck, but by the direct, saving intervention of the Lord himself. The air brakes finished their mournful hiss, leaving an absolute, terrifying stillness in the cab. Leo, breathing shallowly, couldn't move. His gaze was riveted on the 2 feet of empty space separating his massive flat steel bumper from the mangled rear end of the crushed minivan. The minivan had been driven forward into the back of a refrigerated trailer, its rear axle completely gone. As the last tendrils of the storm cleared, the scene ahead became sickeningly clear. This wasn't a minor fender bender, it was a full-scale catastrophe. A chain reaction involving at least 20 vehicles, all piled up in the blind curve of the highway. Dozens of people were trapped, crying out in shock and pain. Leo's truck, positioned like a final, unmoving wall, was the only thing stopping the wreckage from spreading further down the road into the oncoming lane. He slowly released the wheel, his fingers numb, and fumbled for the door handle. He had to help. But as his boots hit the asphalt, a new sound, sharp and metallic, cut through the night. The immense weight of the refrigerated trailer immediately ahead of the minivan, compromised by the impact and the sudden stop, began to groan. Leo stumbled back, shouting warnings that were swallowed by the wind. The crumpled, stressed frame gave way. With a horrifying sound of tearing metal and shattering plastic, the entire back half of the 53-foot trailer collapsed onto the minivan, grinding it further into the asphalt. If Leo had slammed into that minivan even a second later, the force of his impact combined with the structural failure of the trailer would have turned the wreckage into a massive, irreversible tomb. The weight of his truck would have guaranteed the collapse was immediate and total, likely trapping and crushing every survivor within the immediate vicinity, including himself. He stood frozen, watching the collapse. The scale of the death he had been destined to cause and the death he had been saved from hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had been hurtling towards this point of no return, operating on blind, weary arrogance. And the voice had commanded him to stop precisely where the physics of the disaster demanded. Leo walked around the front of his truck, his knees shaking uncontrollably, and looked back toward the driver's side window. The cab was empty, yet the air was still thick with that spiritual resonance, the memory of profound heat and absolute authority. He sank onto the shoulder of the road, burying his face in his hands, no longer thinking about Martha's absence or his own weariness. He thought only of the voice, so clear, so immediate, so utterly personal. He had been wrestling with doubt for 6 months, convinced his prayers were unanswered static. But tonight, when he was weakest, when he was most arrogant, and when the stakes were highest, the Lord had not sent an angel, or a dream, or a feeling. He had spoken, clearly, urgently, and directly into the heart of the darkness. Leo looked up at the starless, dust-choked sky, tears finally mixing with the grit on his face. He understood now. God had not been absent. He had merely been silent, waiting for the one moment when his single saving word would mean the difference between life and death. His life and the lives of dozens of strangers were now a testament to the fact that faith wasn't a feeling you chased, but a certainty that arrived when you least deserved it. Leo remained kneeling on the rough shoulder of the highway, the stench of diesel and burnt rubber filling his lungs, but he felt only the clean, sharp air of spiritual renewal. The chaotic sounds of the wreck, the sirens now wailing in the distance, the shouts of the newly arriving first responders, were secondary to the profound silence ringing in his soul. He had been so lost in the vacuum of his grief, so consumed by the idea that his life no longer mattered without Martha, that he had failed to see the immense tapestry of purpose that still surrounded him. He gently reached into the cab and retrieved Martha's blue glass rosary. Holding the beads, he realized this intervention wasn't just about saving him from a collision. It was about saving his soul from the final crushing weight of despair. He had prayed for comfort, but God had given him clarity. He had asked for a sign, and the Lord had delivered a direct command, saving dozens of lives through the humbled vessel of a weary, faithless trucker. This was the answer to all the static prayers, the endless, desolate miles of doubt. God had not been ignoring him. He had been preparing him. His exhaustion, his choice to drive into the storm, his very moment of greatest weakness had been the perfect stage for a miracle. It was a searing reminder that even when we feel utterly alone, driving headlong into our own personal darkness, the divine watch is always present, ready to intervene at the razor's edge of destruction. Leo stood up, brushing the dirt from his jeans, feeling a strength that hadn't been there 12 hours ago. The weight of Martha's absence was still there, a dull ache, but the emptiness had been filled with the resonant echo of the Savior's voice. He was no longer a lone ship. He was a directed vessel, steered by the ultimate captain. He looked at the wreckage, at the grim reality of what could have been, and then looked toward the sky, now starting to soften with the promise of dawn. The fear was gone, replaced by an overwhelming wave of gratitude so intense it felt physical. He knew what he had to do next. He had to help the survivors, to be the hands and feet of the very presence that had just saved him. He had been chosen, not because he was special, but because he was available. And in the face of this miracle, his life had been redefined. He was a witness. He was redeemed. The road ahead was still long, but Leo Callahan would never again drive it alone. The whisper of the divine had become the unshakable certainty of his presence. The sun, a blazing orb of red and gold, finally broke over the eastern horizon, painting the Arizona sky in hues of fiery promise. Leo stood leaning against the fender of his massive truck, sipping lukewarm coffee handed to him by a young paramedic. The immediate chaos had subsided, the injured had been tended to, and the police were beginning the grueling process of documentation. The silence now was merely human, not spiritual, and it felt heavy with the weight of the night's near tragedy. A state trooper, a woman named Officer Reyes, approached him, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Callahan, we're wrapping up your statement. We need to know exactly how you managed to stop this heavy a rig traveling at that speed, in zero visibility. You were the last vehicle, and frankly, you saved a lot of lives by not becoming part of the chain reaction." Leo looked at the officer, then back at the crushed minivan, now being carefully extracted. He opened his mouth to explain the physics, the air pressure, the instantaneous brake response, but the technicalities felt hollow and false. He looked down at the blue glass rosary he still clutched. "Officer," Leo said, his voice husky but clear, "I wasn't in control. I was tired. I was pushing too hard. I was driving straight into that wall of dust, trying to outrun my own pain." He paused, looking directly into her eyes. "I was going 65 miles an hour when I heard him. The Lord spoke. He told me to put my foot on the floor and stop. There was no doubt, no question. I just obeyed." Officer Reyes stared at him, her professional composure momentarily cracking. She glanced at the wreckage, then back at the old trucker, his face etched with genuine, humbling awe. She scribbled something on her pad, not a note for the report, but perhaps a reminder for herself. "Well, Mr. Callahan," she finally said, her voice softer, "whatever pulled your foot down on that brake, we're all very grateful for the timing." Leo simply nodded. He knew the timing wasn't luck, it was grace. He climbed back into the cab, the seats still radiating the memory of that divine presence. He wasn't just driving a truck, he was carrying a new certainty, that even in the deepest sorrow and darkest confusion, when we feel most adrift, the guardian is watching, and the Lord is ready to speak the exact word we need to hear to survive the next curve. He started the engine, pulling his rig slowly to the side of the road, no longer bound by exhaustion, but energized by the profound, undeniable truth of his miracle. If this story of divine intervention touched your heart, please like and subscribe to Whispers of the Divine for more stories of faith and undeniable miracles. Share this video with someone who needs the comfort of knowing that Jesus Christ is always watching and ready to speak his saving word today.